So this is a chapter in the book Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers by Mary Roach. There's Frankenstein. 9. Just Ahead. Decapitation, reanimation, and the human head transplant. If you really wanted to know for sure that the human soul resides in the brain, you could cut off a man's head and ask it. You would have to ask quickly, for the human brain cut off from its blood supply will slide into unconsciousness after 10 or 12 seconds. You would, further, have to instruct the man to answer with blinks, for having been divorced from his lungs, he can pull no air through his larynx and thus can no longer speak. But it could be done, and if the man seemed more or less the same individual he was before you cut off his head, perhaps a little less calm, then you would know that indeed the self is there in the brain. In Paris, in 1795, an experiment very much like this was nearly undertaken. 4 years before, the guillotine had replaced the noose as the executioner's official tool. The device was named after Joseph Ignatz Guillotine, though he did not invent it. He merely lobbied for its use on the grounds that decapitating machine, as he preferred to call it, was an instantaneous and thus more humane way to kill. And then he read this. Do you know that it is not at all certain when a head is severed from the body by the guillotine that the feelings, personality, and ego are instantaneously abolished? Don't you know that the seat of the feelings and appreciation is in the brain? That this seat of consciousness can continue to operate even when the circulation of the blood is cut off from the brain? Thus, for as long as the brain retains its vital force, the victim is aware of his existence. Remember that Haller insists that a head, having been removed from the shoulders of a man, grimaced horribly when a surgeon who was present stuck a finger into the Rakidian canal. Furthermore, credible witnesses have assured me that they have seen teeth grind after the head has been separated from the trunk. And I am convinced that if the air could still circulate through the organs of the voice, these heads would speak. The guillotine is a terrible torture. We must return to hanging. The notion of the living head had made its way into the public consciousness in even more popular literature. Below is a conversation between a pair of fictional executioners in Alexander Dumas's Millet and Defense. Do you believe that they're dead because they've been guillotined? Undoubtedly. Well, one can see that you don't look into the basket when they are all there together. You've never seen them twist their eyes and grind their teeth for a good 5 minutes after the execution. We are forced to change the basket every 3 months because they cause such damage to the bottom. Shortly after Sommering's and Sue's pronouncements, George Martin, an assistant to the official Paris executioner and witnesses to some 120 beheadings, was interviewed on the subject of heads and their post-execution activities. Sobrian writes that he cast his lot, not surprisingly, on the side of instantaneous death. He claimed to have viewed all 120 heads within 2 seconds, and always the eyes were fixed. The immobility of the lids was total. The lips were already white. Medical science was, for the moment, reassured, and the furor dissipated. But French science was not through with heads. A physiologist named Legalois surmised in an 1812 paper that if the personality did indeed reside within the brain, it should be possible to revive by giving an injection of oxygenated blood through its severed cerebral arteries. If a physiologist attempted this experiment on the head of a guillotined man a few instants after death, wrote Legalois' colleague Professor Beauvien, he would perhaps bear witness to a terrible sight. Theoretically, for as long as the blood supply lasted, the head would be able to think, hear, see, smell, grind its teeth, twist its eyes, chew up the lab table, for all the nerves above the neck would still be intact and attached to the organs and muscles of the head. The head wouldn't be able to speak, owing to the aforementioned disabling of the larynx, but this was probably, from the perspective of the experimenter, just as well. In 1857, the French physician Brown-Séquard cut the head off a dog to see if he could put it back into action with arterial injections of oxygenated blood. 8 minutes after the head parted company with the neck, the injections began. 2 or 3 minutes later, Brown-Séquard noted movements in the eyes and facial muscles that appeared to him to be voluntarily directed. Clearly something was going on in the animal's brain. With the steady supply of guillotines had in Paris, it was only a matter of time before someone tried this out on a human. The man for the job was Jean-Baptiste Vincent Lombard. In 1884, the French authorities began supplying Lombard with the heads of guillotined prisoners, so that he could examine the state of their brain and nervous system. Reports of these experiments appeared in various French medical journals, Revue Scientifique being the main one. It was hoped that Laborde would get to the bottom of what he called a terrible legend, that it was possible for guillotined heads to be aware, if only for a moment, of their situation, in a basket without a butt. Upon a head's arrival in his lab, he would quickly bore holes in the skull and insert needles into the brain in an attempt to trigger nervous system responses. Following Brown-Séquard's lead, he also tried resuscitating the heads with a supply of blood. Laborde's first subject was a murderer named Campi. From Laborde's description, he was not a typical thug. He had delicate ankles and white, well-manicured hands. His skin was unblemished save for an abrasion on the left cheek, which Laborde surmised was the result of the head's drop into the guillotine basket. Laborde didn't typically spend so much time personalizing his subjects, preferring to call them simply restus frais. The term means literally fresh remains. Campi arrived in 2 pieces, and he arrived late. Under ideal circumstances, the distance from the scaffold to Laborde's lab on Rue Vanclin could be covered in about 7 minutes. Campi's commute took an hour and 20 minutes, owing to what Laborde called that stupid law forbidding scientists to take possession of the remains of executed criminals until the bodies had crossed the threshold of the city cemetery. This meant Laborde's driver had to follow the heads as they made the sentimental journey to the turnip field, and then pack them up and bring them all the way back across town to the lab. Needless to say, Campi's brain had long since ceased to function in anything close to a normal state. Infuriated by the waste of 80 critical post-mortem minutes, Laborde decided to meet his next head at the cemetery gates and set directly to work on it. He and his assistants rigged a makeshift traveling laboratory in the back of a horse-drawn van, complete with lab table, 5 stools, candles, and the necessary equipment. The second subject was named Gamahut, a fact unlikely to be forgotten, owing to the man's having had his name tattooed on his torso. Eerily, as though presaging his gory fate, he had also been tattooed with a portrait of himself from the neck up, which, without the lines of a frame to suggest an unseen body, gave him the appearance of a floating head. Within minutes of its arrival in the van, Gamahut's head was installed in a septic-lined container, and the men set to work, drilling holes in the skull and inserting needles into various regions of the brain to see if they could coax any activity out of the criminal's moribund nervous system. The ability to perform brain surgery while traveling full tilt on a cobblestone street is testament to the steadiness of Laborde's hand and/or the craftsmanship of 19th century brogans. Laborde's team ran current through the needles, and the Gamahut head could be seen to make predictable twitches of lip and jaw. At one point, to the astonished shouts of all present, the prisoner slowly opened one eye, as if with great and understandable trepidation. He sought to figure out where he was and what sort of strange locality hell had turned out to be. But of course, given the amount of time that had elapsed, the movement could have been nothing beyond a primitive reflex. The third time around, Laborde resorted to basic bribery to expedite his head deliveries. With the help of the local municipality chief, the third head, that of a man named Gagny, was delivered to his lab just shy of 7 minutes after the chop. The arteries on the right side of the neck were injected with oxygenated cow's blood, and, in a break from Brown-Séquard's protocol, the arteries on the other side were connected to those of a living animal. Laborde had an interesting flair for details, which the medical journals of his day seemed pleased to accommodate. He devoted a full paragraph to an artful description of a severed head resting upright on the lab table, rocking ever so slightly left and right from the pulsing pressure of the dog's blood as it pumped into the head. In another paper, he took pains to detail the post-mortem contents of Gamahut's excretory organs, though the information bore no relation to the experiment at hand, noting with seeming fascination that the stomach and intestines were completely empty, save for a little poop at the far end. With the Gagny head, Laborde came closest to restoring normal brain function. Muscles on the eyelids, foreheads, and jaw could be made to contract. At one point, Gagny's jaw snapped shut so forcefully that a loud claquement dentaire was heard. However, given that 20 minutes had passed from the drop of the blade to the infusion of blood, and irreversible brain death sets in after 6 to 10 minutes, it is certain that Gagny's brain was too far gone to be brought around to anything resembling consciousness, and he remained blessedly ignorant of his dismaying state of affairs. Pichin, on the other hand, spent its final decidedly vigorous minutes watching its blood pump into someone else's head. Laborde soon lost interest in heads, but a team of French experimenters named Hayem and Barrier took up where he left off. The two became something of a cottage industry, transfusing a total of 22 dog heads, using blood from live horses and dogs. They built a tabletop guillotine specially fitted to the canine neck. 18 years later, a French physician by the name of Beaurix confirmed Hayem and Barrett's observations and summering suspicions. Using Paris's public scaffold as his lab, he carried out a series of simple observations and experiments on the head of a prisoner named Longueuil, the instant after the guillotine blade dropped. Here, then, is what I was able to note immediately after the decapitation. The eyelids and lips of the guillotined man worked in irregularly rhythmic contractions for about 5 or 6 seconds, and ceased. The face relaxed, the lid half closed on the eyeballs, exactly as in the dying whom we have occasion to see every day in the exercise of our profession. It was then that I called in a strong, sharp voice, "Longueuil!" I then saw the eyelids lift slowly up, without any spasmodic contraction, such as happens in everyday life with people awakened or torn from their thoughts. Next, Longueuil's eyes very definitely fixed themselves on mine, and the pupils focused themselves. I was not then dealing with the sort of vague, dull look, without any expression that can be observed in any day in dying people whom one speaks. I was dealing with undeniably living eyes which were looking at me. After several seconds, the eyelids closed again, slowly and evenly, and the head took on the same appearance as it had before I called out. It was at that point that I called out again, and once more, without any spasm, slowly the eyelids lifted, and undeniably living eyes fixed themselves on mine, with perhaps even more penetration than the first time. I attempted the effect of a third call. There was no further movement, and the eyes took on the glazed look which they have in the dead. You know, of course, where this is leading. It is leading toward human head transplants. If a brain, a personality, and its surrounding head can be kept functional with an outside blood supply for as long as that supply lasts, then why not go the whole hog and actually transplant it onto a living, breathing body so it has an ongoing blood supply? Fast forward a few years. The first dog heads to enjoy, if that word can be used, full cerebral function were those of transplantation whiz Vladimir Demikov in the Soviet Union in the 1950s. Demikov minimized the time that the severed donor head was without oxygen by using blood vessel sewing machines. He transplanted 20 puppy heads, actually head, shoulders, lungs, and forelimb units with an esophagus that emptied untidily onto the outside of the dog, onto fully grown dogs to see what they'd do and how long they'd last, usually from 2 to 6 days, but in one case as long as 29 days. Demikov's transplant subjects were typically done in by immune reactions. Immunosuppressive drugs weren't yet available, and the immune system of the intact dog would, understandably enough, treat the dog parts grafted to its neck as a hostile invader and proceed accordingly. While the musical tissues of Guthrie and Demikov's transplanted dog heads began swelling and hemorrhaging within a day or two of the operation, the brains at autopsy appeared normal. Here is where it begins to get strange. In the mid-1960s, a neurosurgeon named Robert White began experimenting with isolated brain preparations, a living brain taken out of one animal, hooked up to another animal's circulatory system, and kept alive. Unlike Demikov's and Guthrie's whole head transplants, these brains, lacking faces and sensory organs, would live a life confined to memory and thought. Given that many of these dogs and monkey brains were implanted inside the necks and abdomens of other animals, this could only have been a blessing. While the inside of someone else's abdomen is of moderate interest in a sort of curiosity-seeking surgical channel sort of way, it's not the sort of place you want to settle down and live out the remainder of your years. White figured out that by cooling the brain during the procedure to slow the process by which cellular damage occurs, a technique used today in organ recovery and transplant operations, it was possible to retain most of the organ's normal functions, which means that the personality, the psyche, the spirit, the soul of those monkeys continued to exist for days on end without its body or any of its senses inside another animal. What must that have been like? What could possibly be the purpose, the justification? Had White been thinking one day of isolating a human brain like this? What kind of person comes up with a plan like this and carries it out?